Sarah Mitchell thought she'd hit the jackpot when she snagged Manhattan's most eligible bachelor, James Woodworth III. With his tailored suits, family fortune, and irresistible charm, he seemed like her ticket to the high life she'd always craved. But as their whirlwind romance turns into marriage, Sarah discovers that playing with deception is a dangerous game, and she's not the only one wearing a mask. Sarah Mitchell stood before the floor-length mirror in her Manhattan apartment, adjusting the designer dress that had cost her nearly 2 months' salary. At 32, she had grown tired of living paycheck to paycheck, watching her college friends post photos from exotic vacations, while she could barely afford her rent. That's why tonight had to go perfectly. Her date with James Woodworth III was her ticket to the life she'd always dreamed of. She had met James at a charity gala 3 weeks ago, where he had commanded attention with his tailored Armani suit and sophisticated demeanor. He spoke of his family's banking empire, their summer house in the Hamptons, and their philanthropic foundation. Sarah had been instantly smitten, not just by his charm and good looks, but by the promise of financial security he represented. The doorbell rang precisely at 7. James stood there, looking impeccable as always, in a navy suit that seemed to shimmer under the hallway lights. He handed her a bouquet of roses that she was certain cost more than her weekly grocery budget. "You look stunning," he said, his green eyes twinkling. "Shall we? I've made reservations at Le Bernardin." Sarah's heart fluttered. Le Bernardin was exactly the kind of restaurant she'd always wanted to frequent, but could never afford on her public relations specialist's salary. As they rode down in the elevator, she caught a whiff of his cologne, something expensive and subtle, like everything else about him. Their courtship was a whirlwind of luxury and romance. James took her to the opera, flew her to Miami for weekend getaways, and introduced her to his seemingly wealthy friends who all lived in penthouses and drove German cars. When he proposed after just 4 months with a massive diamond ring, Sarah said yes without hesitation. The wedding was lavish, held at the Plaza Hotel with 500 guests. Sarah's mother had expressed concern about the rushed nature of the relationship, but Sarah dismissed her worries. "Mom, he's a Woodworth," she had said. "Do you know how much their family is worth?" It wasn't until after the honeymoon in Bali that the first crack appeared in James's perfect facade. They were supposed to move into his family's Park Avenue apartment, but James suddenly suggested they stay in Sarah's place temporarily. He claimed the family apartment was being renovated, but weeks turned into months with no mention of moving. Then came the excuses about his credit cards being declined. "Just a mix-up with the bank," he'd say smoothly. "Would you mind covering this one, darling? I'll transfer the money to you tomorrow." Tomorrow never seemed to come. Sarah started noticing other inconsistencies. The Rolex watch he wore had a slightly off-center logo. His stories about boarding school at Exeter contained details that didn't quite add up. Most troubling were the calls from unknown numbers that he'd rushed to answer in private, returning with a strained smile and vague explanations. One evening, while James was in the shower, his phone lit up with a text message. Sarah normally wouldn't have looked, but the preview caught her eye. "Payment overdue. Final notice." Her stomach churned as she opened his phone. He'd used her birthday as his password, how romantic she'd once thought, and found dozens of similar messages. The rabbit hole went deeper. His emails revealed he'd been bouncing checks for months. The foundation he claimed to run didn't exist. The Miami apartment they had stayed in was an Airbnb, not his property. Even his surname was fake. His driver's license read James Wilson. But what made her blood run cold was finding her own bank statements in his email drafts folder, along with detailed notes about her savings accounts, inheritance prospects, and family property. He'd been researching her finances long before they'd accidentally met at that charity gala. Sarah sat on the edge of their bed, her world spinning. The shower was still running, and she could hear James humming, the same sophisticated tune he always hummed, which she now realized was probably another calculated detail in his carefully constructed persona. She thought about her dwindling savings account, the credit card bills she'd been paying, and the temporary loans she'd given him. The numbers made her dizzy. How had she not seen it? She, who prided herself on being smart and independent, had fallen for the oldest trick in the book. But as she heard the shower turn off, Sarah made a decision. Two could play at this game. If James thought he had married a naive socialite wannabe, he was about to learn otherwise. Her PR career had taught her a thing or two about managing perceptions and playing the long game. "Everything okay, darling?" James asked, emerging from the bathroom in his monogrammed robe. Probably another fake, she now realized. "Perfect," Sarah smiled, sliding his phone back onto the nightstand. "I was just thinking about how lucky I am to have married such a wonderful man." James beamed, completely missing the steel behind her eyes. "I'm the lucky one," he said, kissing her forehead. "By the way, I was thinking of investing in this amazing opportunity. Would you be interested in joining me? We could use that inheritance your aunt left you." Sarah maintained her smile, but her mind was already racing, formulating plans. She thought about the detailed documentation she would need, the evidence she would have to gather, and the network she would have to build. Most importantly, she thought about patience, the kind of patience that would make James's long con look amateur in comparison. "Tell me more about this investment," she said, patting the bed beside her. "I want to hear everything." As James launched into another one of his perfectly polished pitches, Sarah noted how his gestures and expressions were just a little too practiced, his enthusiasm a touch too perfect. She wondered how many other women he had performed this scene for, how many others had fallen for the character of James Woodworth III. Well, he was about to learn that he wasn't the only one who could play a role. Sarah had spent her career crafting narratives and managing crisis situations for high-profile clients. Now, she would put those skills to personal use. The only question was, how far would she take it? The next morning, Sarah began implementing subtle changes to their routine. She casually mentioned wanting to learn more about finance, asking James to explain various investment concepts. Each time he fumbled or gave vague answers, she noted it while maintaining an expression of adoring admiration. She started leaving financial magazines around the apartment, watching how he would quickly skim them before conversations, probably trying to maintain his facade of expertise. She mentioned friends who had lost money in scams, carefully observing how he would shift in his seat or change the subject. Weeks passed, and Sarah meticulously documented everything while playing the role of devoted wife. She recorded conversations, photographed documents, and built a detailed timeline of his deceptions. At night, lying beside the man she had married, she would mentally review her growing list of evidence, planning her next moves like a chess player, thinking several steps ahead. But the most challenging part was maintaining the illusion of their perfect marriage. Sarah attended charity events on James's arm, laughing at his jokes and pretending not to notice how he would disappear at convenient moments to avoid talking to anyone who might expose his lies. She hosted dinner parties where she would subtly guide conversations away from topics that might trap him in his own web of deception. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had married James thinking he was her ticket to a better life, only to discover he had targeted her for the same reason. Now they were both pretending, both playing roles, both waiting for the other to make a mistake. It was exhausting, exhilarating, and terrifying all at once. One evening, as they were preparing for yet another social event, Sarah caught James studying her with an unreadable expression. For a moment, she wondered if he had figured out that she knew, if her performance had slipped somewhere. But then he smiled that perfect smile of his and helped her with her necklace, his fingers lingering just a moment too long on her neck. "You know what I love about you, Sarah?" he said, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "You're not like other women. You understand the importance of appearance, of maintaining a certain image. Some people might call it fake, but we know better, don't we? It's all about creating the life you want." Sarah smiled back, even as her skin crawled. "Yes, darling," she replied. "It's all about creating the perfect life." And so, their dance continued, each playing their part, each waiting for the other to stumble. Sarah knew she was taking a risk by staying, but she had invested too much to walk away now. Besides, there was something almost addictive about the game they were playing, about watching James perform his role while knowing the truth behind his mask. She wondered how long they could maintain this charade, how many more dinner parties and charity galas they could attend while pretending to be people they weren't. She wondered what James's endgame was, how much money he hoped to extract from her before moving on to his next target. But mostly she wondered about herself. Had she become so focused on exposing James's deception that she was losing sight of who she really was? Was she any better than him now, living this elaborate lie? These thoughts kept her awake at night, staring at the ceiling while James slept peacefully beside her, unaware that his perfect plan was slowly unraveling. As autumn turned to winter, Sarah noticed James becoming more aggressive in his attempts to access her finances. His investment proposals became more frequent, his stories about temporary cash flow problems more elaborate. She recognized the signs of desperation beginning to crack his smooth veneer, and she knew she would need to act soon. But timing would be crucial. One wrong move, one premature revelation, and everything she had worked for could collapse. So she continued to play her part, continued to gather evidence, continued to watch and wait. The question wasn't if their carefully constructed house of cards would fall, but when and who would be left standing when it did. Each morning, as she applied her makeup and prepared for another day of deception, Sarah would look at herself in the mirror and wonder what her younger self would think of the woman she had become. The idealistic girl who had once dreamed of true love and happiness had been replaced by someone else entirely. Someone who understood that sometimes the only way to fight deception was with deception itself. 3 days before Christmas, James announced he had to leave town for an emergency business meeting. Sarah knew better than to question the convenient timing. He'd likely run out of excuses for not buying her a gift. She kissed him goodbye, played the role of disappointed wife, and waited until his taxi had turned the corner before springing into action. She had prepared for this opportunity, knowing it would come. Within hours, her apartment was transformed into a command center of sorts. Papers covered the dining room table, bank statements, credit card bills, photographs, and transcripts of recorded conversations. Sarah worked through the night, organizing everything chronologically, building a case that would be impossible to deny. But as she sifted through the evidence of James's deception, she found herself confronting uncomfortable truths about her own motivations. Each document seemed to mock her initial attraction to him, her willingness to ignore red flags in pursuit of wealth. The distinction between victim and accomplice began to blur in her mind. The holidays passed in a blur of fake smiles and elaborate excuses to both their families about why they were celebrating separately. James returned on New Year's Eve, full of apologies and bearing a suspiciously nice watch that Sarah strongly suspected was stolen. She accepted it with appropriate enthusiasm, all while noting how he fidgeted with his collar. A tell she'd learned meant he was particularly nervous about something. That something became clear a week later when he began floating the idea of relocating to Singapore. "There's an amazing opportunity," he explained over dinner, his fork pushing food around his plate in precise patterns. "We could double, even triple our money within months." Sarah recognized the desperation beneath his polished pitch. His usual hunting grounds were becoming too hot, too many questions being asked in their social circles. She watched him talk, noting how his usually steady hands trembled slightly when he reached for his wine glass. "It sounds wonderful," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "Tell me more about the investors. Are they the same ones from that Dubai project you mentioned?" She saw the flash of panic in his eyes before he recovered, launching into an elaborate story that contradicted his previous tales about Middle Eastern connections. Sarah recorded everything on her phone, hidden in her purse beside her plate. January brought record-breaking cold to New York, but the real chill was in their apartment. James's calls became more frequent and furtive. Sarah noticed him selling off his collection of supposedly expensive watches. One particularly bad day, she came home early to find him arguing loudly on the phone in what sounded like Russian, a language he'd claimed not to speak. That night, she added another page to her growing file, a transcript of the conversation, translated by a friend who owed her a favor from her PR days. The contents confirmed her suspicions about James's connections to certain Eastern European business associates. Their second Valentine's Day as a married couple arrived with a strange tension in the air. James seemed distracted, his usual smooth charm fraying at the edges. He took her to an expensive restaurant, her treat, though he didn't know she knew that his credit cards were all maxed out. And halfway through dinner, he dropped a bomb. "Darling," he said, reaching for her hand across the table, "I've been thinking about our future. What would you say to selling your apartment? With the market so high right now, we could make a killing, and I have this amazing investment opportunity." Sarah felt a surge of something between anger and pity. This was it. His real play, finally revealed. The apartment she'd inherited from her grandmother, the only real asset she had. She'd been waiting for this moment, but the raw nakedness of his greed still stunned her. She took a sip of wine, buying time to compose her response. "That's an interesting idea," she said carefully. "Tell me more about this investment." Is it related to that tech startup you mentioned last month? Or is this something new? As James launched into his pitch, Sarah noted 3 different contradictions in his story within the first minute. She nodded attentively, playing her part while her mind raced ahead to the next phase of her plan. The time for waiting was almost over. That night, as James slept beside her, Sarah lay awake thinking about the path that had led her here. She thought about the young woman she'd been, so eager for a taste of luxury that she'd ignored every warning sign. She thought about James, who had probably started small with his cons before graduating to the larger targets. She wondered if he ever felt guilty, if he ever lay awake at night thinking about the lives he'd ruined. The next morning, Sarah made a call to her old friend at the SEC, setting certain wheels in motion. Then she began preparations for the next phase of her plan, knowing that timing would be crucial. James wasn't the only one who knew how to play the long game, and she had learned from the best, himself. As winter slowly gave way to spring, Sarah watched James's composure continue to deteriorate. His stories became more elaborate, his excuses more desperate. She knew he was running out of options, and a desperate con man was a dangerous one. But she had come too far to back down now. One rainy March evening, as they sat in their living room, pretending to be a normal married couple, James received a phone call that made his face turn pale. Sarah pretended to be absorbed in her book while straining to hear his whispered conversation. When he hung up, his hands were shaking. "Everything all right, darling?" she asked, maintaining her concerned wife facade. "Of course," he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just some business matters that need attention. Actually, I might need to travel again soon." Sarah nodded sympathetically, already knowing what his next move would be. The pieces were all in place now. She just had to wait for him to make that final, fatal mistake. And knowing James, he wouldn't keep her waiting long. The following week brought torrential spring rains to Manhattan, matching the turbulent atmosphere in the Mitchell-Woodworth household. James's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would pace the apartment late into the night, having whispered conversations on the balcony despite the downpour. Sarah noticed him making frequent trips to various banks around the city, always returning more agitated than when he left. One particular Tuesday, Sarah followed him discreetly to a rundown cafe in Queens, far from his usual haunts. Through the grimy window, she photographed his meeting with a rough-looking man whose tattoos and nervous demeanor suggested connections to a world far removed from the refined society James pretended to inhabit. The man passed James a thick envelope, which he quickly stuffed into his jacket. That evening, James announced he had to make an emergency trip to London. "Family business," he explained, not meeting her eyes. "Very urgent. I'll only be gone a week, 2 at most." Sarah knew this was it, the beginning of his exit strategy. She'd seen the one-way ticket to Buenos Aires on his laptop earlier that week, but she just smiled and helped him pack, secretly noting everything he took and everything he left behind. "Don't forget your passport, darling," she said sweetly, handing him the document she knew was filled with lies. "And make sure to pick up that gift for your mother you mentioned." They both knew he had no mother in London, but maintaining the charade had become second nature to them both. After James left for the airport, Sarah put the final pieces of her plan into motion. First, she called her contact at the SEC, confirming that everything was ready. Then she reached out to Detective Martinez, who had been building a case against James for months based on her evidence. Finally, she contacted her lawyer, ensuring all the paperwork was in order. The next morning, she was watching the news over coffee when a familiar face appeared on the screen. Not James's face, at least not the James she knew, but a man identified as Stefan Kovac, wanted in 3 countries for investment fraud and identity theft. The resemblance was undeniable, though in this photo, he had darker hair and no carefully maintained stubble. Sarah's phone began ringing immediately. It was James, his smooth voice now tinged with panic. "Darling, there seems to be some problem with my accounts. A misunderstanding with the bank. Would you be able to wire me some money? Just temporarily, of course." "Of course, darling," Sarah replied calmly. "How much do you need? And should I wire it to London or perhaps Buenos Aires?" The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. When James finally spoke, his voice had lost all its cultured polish. "How long have you known?" Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "Long enough? Did you really think I wouldn't investigate the man I married? I'm a PR specialist, James. Or should I say Stefan? Uncovering people's secrets is quite literally my job. You don't understand, he said, desperation creeping into his voice. There are people after me. Dangerous people. I need that money, Sarah. Think about everything we've shared. You mean like the fake stories about your family, the stolen watches, the borrowed apartments? Or perhaps you mean the careful research you did on my finances before orchestrating our chance meeting? She could hear street noise in the background. He wasn't in London or Buenos Aires yet, probably still in New York, planning his next move. The police have everything, James. Every document, every recording, every piece of evidence. They also have the names of your other wives, the ones you've been hiding money from across Europe. They were quite interested in comparing notes. You've been playing me this whole time, he said, and for the first time, Sarah heard genuine admiration in his voice. I have to admit, I didn't see that coming. I learned from the best, Sarah replied. You taught me how to be patient, how to maintain a perfect facade, how to wait for exactly the right moment. I just turned out to be a better student than you expected. A harsh laugh came through the phone. So what now? You turn me in, play the victimized wife, take your revenge? Sarah leaned back in her chair, watching the rain against her window. Now you have exactly 30 minutes before my friends at the SEC freeze every account you've touched. The NYPD has your photo, your real photo, Stefan. And I imagine those dangerous people you mentioned will be very interested in the evidence I've gathered about your activities in Eastern Europe. You're bluffing, he said, but she could hear the fear in his voice. Am I? Check your accounts. She heard rapid typing, then a sharp intake of breath. You couldn't have... How did you... Like I said, 30 minutes. After that, every document, every transaction, every alias goes public. Unless what? The polished James Woodworth III was completely gone now, replaced by the desperate man he'd always been underneath. Sarah smiled, even though he couldn't see it. Unless we make a deal. One final con, you might say. Only this time, I'm the one making the rules. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of everything unsaid. Sarah could almost see him calculating odds, weighing options, looking for an angle, just as she had done so many months ago when she first discovered his deception. I'm listening, he finally said. Sarah glanced at her watch. 25 minutes now. Shall we discuss terms? The terms are simple, Sarah continued, her voice steady and professional. You have accounts I don't know about, safety nets you've hidden away. I want access to all of them. Every last penny you've stolen from other women, from other marks. You're going to transfer it all to a specific account. And if I refuse? James's voice had taken on an edge she'd never heard before. Then I release everything, not just to the police, but to everyone. Your other victims, your business associates, those dangerous friends of yours in Eastern Europe. I imagine they'll be particularly interested in learning how you've been skimming from their operations. She heard him inhale sharply. You're playing a dangerous game, Sarah. I learned from the best, remember? 19 minutes now. The sound of rapid movement came through the phone. Footsteps, a door slamming. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't access all those accounts that quickly. You don't have to, Sarah replied calmly. I've already done most of the work. Check your email. A moment of silence, then a quietly muttered curse. Sarah had sent him a detailed list of every account she'd uncovered, including ones he thought were completely untraceable. The result of months of meticulous investigation and some very expensive help from people who specialized in finding things that didn't want to be found. How did you... 15 minutes, James. Or should I start making calls? She could practically hear him thinking, calculating, looking for a way out. But she had closed off every escape route, anticipated every move, just as he had taught her to do, unknowingly creating the architect of his own downfall. The money goes to charity, Sarah said, filling the silence. Every cent. Women's shelters, victim support organizations, financial literacy programs. A fitting end to your career, don't you think? You expect me to believe you're doing this out of some noble cause? His laugh was bitter. You're just like me, Sarah. You married me for money. True, she admitted. I did marry you for money. The difference is, I learned from my mistake. You just kept making the same one over and over, hurting more people, destroying more lives. Consider this an intervention. 10 minutes, she added when he didn't respond. The sound of typing filled the line. Sarah watched her laptop screen as notifications began appearing. Transfers from accounts in Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, Dubai, Singapore. James worked quickly, his expertise in moving money finally being put to legitimate use. "There," he said finally. "It's done. Everything I have, given to charity. Happy now?" Sarah checked the transfers, noting with satisfaction that the amounts matched her intelligence exactly. "Almost everything," she corrected. "You're holding back the account in Macau." Another curse. "How are you always one step ahead?" "5 minutes, James." More typing, another transfer. Sarah nodded to herself as she verified the final amount. "You've ruined me," he said, and for the first time, she heard real emotion in his voice. "Everything I've worked for, everything I've built." "You mean everything you've stolen?" Sarah's voice hardened. "The lives you've destroyed, the trust you've broken? Yes, I've taken it all away, but I'm giving you something in return." "What's that?" "A chance to disappear. The evidence stays sealed as long as you vanish, completely and permanently. No more cons, no more marks, no more stealing from women who made the mistake of trusting you. If I ever hear of you operating again, anywhere in the world, everything goes public, and I mean everything." The silence stretched between them, heavy with understanding. Finally, James spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "You really are better at this than I am." "Goodbye, James," Sarah said, and ended the call. She sat in her apartment, not their apartment, and watched the rain continue to fall over Manhattan. Her phone buzzed with a message from Detective Martinez. "Target boarding flight to Hong Kong. Want us to stop him?" "Let him go," Sarah typed back. She had meant what she said about giving him a chance to disappear. Besides, she had what she wanted, justice for his victims, even if they would never know it. Her laptop pinged with confirmations from the various charities receiving the transferred funds. Millions of dollars, all of it now going to help people instead of hurt them. It felt like a fitting end to this chapter of her life. Sarah walked to her bedroom and began packing away James's remaining belongings. As she worked, she thought about the woman she had been when this all started, desperate for wealth, willing to compromise her values for a taste of luxury. That woman was gone now, replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and perhaps a bit more cynical. Her phone buzzed again, another message from Martinez. "You sure about this? We could still nail him." Sarah stared at the message for a long moment, thinking about justice and revenge, about right and wrong, about the fine line between being the hero and being the villain. "Let him run," Sarah typed back to Martinez. "Sometimes the fear of consequences is a better deterrent than the consequences themselves." She set her phone down and walked to the window, watching the city lights flicker through the rain. The detective couldn't understand, that this wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about transformation, both James's and her own. A week passed, then 2. Sarah settled back into her life, but everything felt different now. Her apartment, once a showcase for James's borrowed luxury, became a space of authentic comfort. She donated his left-behind designer clothes, replaced the fake artwork with local artists' pieces, and slowly erased every trace of the life they'd pretended to live. The first check arrived on a Tuesday, a thank you letter from a women's shelter that had received one of the anonymous donations. Sarah pinned it to her bulletin board, a reminder of something good emerging from all the deception. But life has a way of complicating even the most carefully orchestrated plans. 3 months after James's disappearance, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. The woman was elegant, probably in her 50s, with steel gray hair and eyes that seemed to look right through Sarah's carefully maintained composure. "My name is Helena Kovac," she said when Sarah opened the door. "I believe you know my son, though you probably knew him as James Woodworth." Sarah's mind raced. Nothing in her extensive research had suggested Stefan's mother was still alive. Yet here she was, standing in Sarah's doorway, with an expression that suggested she had her own stories to tell. "Please come in," Sarah said, her PR training taking over, as she processed this new development. "Would you like some tea?" Helena settled onto Sarah's couch with the air of someone used to commanding attention. "You've done something remarkable," she said, declining the offered tea with a wave. "Something I've been trying to do for 20 years. "I'm not sure I understand," Sarah replied carefully. "You stopped him," Helena said simply. "More than that, you made him face consequences without destroying him completely. It's not what I expected when I first learned about you. Sarah sat down slowly, studying the woman across from her. How long have you known about me? A small smile played at Helena's lips. My dear, I've known about every one of Stefan's cons, every identity he's stolen, every woman he's deceived. I've tried to warn them, tried to stop him, but he's always been too clever, too quick, until you. The implications of this revelation spun through Sarah's mind. The anonymous tip about his accounts in McCall. I may have helped point you in the right direction, Helena acknowledged, but everything else, the investigation, the evidence gathering, the final confrontation, that was all you. You did what I never could. You gave him a chance to choose a different path. Sarah leaned back, processing this information. And has he? Chosen a different path? He's in Montenegro, Helena said, pulling an envelope from her purse. Working as a consultant for a legitimate business. Small salary, honest work. It's different from anything he's done before. She handed Sarah the envelope. Inside was a photograph of James, Stefan, looking different than she'd ever seen him. Gone was the carefully maintained appearance of wealth. He looked simpler, more genuine somehow. Why are you showing me this? Sarah asked. Because you deserve to know that your plan worked, not just the part about recovering the money or bringing some justice to his victims. The part about transformation. Helena stood, smoothing her impeccable skirt. And because I need your help. Sarah felt a familiar tension in her shoulders. What kind of help? Stefan isn't the only one running these kinds of cons. There are others, organized groups, doing far more damage than my son ever did. I've spent years gathering information, but I need someone with your skills to put it to use. Sarah studied the older woman, understanding dawning. You want me to do it again, stop them like I stopped him. I want you to help me prevent more victims, more ruined lives. Helena moved toward the door, then paused. Think about it. You have a unique set of skills now, a unique perspective. It would be a shame to waste them. She left Sarah with a business card, blank except for a phone number, and the weight of a decision that would alter the course of her life once again. Sarah returned to the window, the photograph still in her hand. The rain had stopped, leaving the city streets gleaming under the early evening light. She thought about everything that had led her to this moment, her own greed, James's deception, the months of careful planning, and now this unexpected proposition. The business card seemed to burn in her pocket as she considered Helena's offer. It would be dangerous work, but hadn't she already proven she could handle danger? It would mean living in a world of deception again, but this time for a different purpose. Her phone buzzed with another message from Detective Martinez. Got something you might be interested in. Similar case, bigger stakes. Want to hear more? Sarah took a deep breath, considering her response. Sarah stared at Martinez's message, then at Helena's business card. Two paths, both leading into shadows, but with different destinations. She thought about what she'd learned from her time with James. Not just about deception, but about herself. About her capacity for patience, for strategy, for walking the line between right and wrong. Send me the details, she typed to Martinez, then added Helena's number to her contacts. She didn't have to choose one path over the other, not yet. Perhaps there was a way to work both angles, to use every resource available in this new mission she was contemplating. The next morning, Sarah woke early and began her research. Martinez had sent over files about a sophisticated ring of con artists, targeting wealthy widows across the East Coast. The pattern was familiar, too familiar. As she dug deeper, she found connections that couldn't be coincidental. Her phone rang around noon. Helena. I assume you've started looking into the Richardson case, Helena said without preamble. Sarah wasn't surprised that Helena knew about Martinez's files. The widows? Yes. I see why you came to me now. This is bigger than James, than Stefan. Much bigger, Helena confirmed. These people taught him everything he knows. They're the ones who turned him into what he became, and they're still out there, destroying lives on a scale you haven't seen yet. Sarah pulled up another document on her laptop, a list of victims that stretched back decades. Why haven't they been caught? Because they have protection in high places. Politicians, judges, even some law enforcement. They've spent years building a network of influence using their stolen money. The kind of network that makes them practically untouchable through normal channels. And you think I can help take them down? I think you've proven you know how to work outside normal channels, Helena said, and I think you understand something crucial that law enforcement doesn't. Sometimes you have to play the long game. Sarah thought about her months of gathering evidence against James, about the careful orchestration of his downfall. It would be dangerous, she said, though it wasn't really a question. Very. These people won't just run away to Montenegro if they're exposed. They'll fight back, hard. Through her window, Sarah could see the city coming to life, people rushing about their daily routines, unaware of the shadows moving among them. "Tell me everything," she said. Helena's voice took on a tone of careful precision. "There's a charity gala next month at the Metropolitan Museum. Many of their top operators will be there, along with their current marks. They don't know that James was connected to me, don't know that I've been watching them all these years. We could use that." "You want me to go in?" Sarah said, understanding immediately. "To play the part of another wealthy target. You've proven you can maintain a cover, and you know their techniques from the inside now. You'd see things others would miss." Sarah opened her laptop, already pulling up information about the gala. "I'll need resources, equipment, a solid backstory they can't crack. Detective Martinez can help with some of that, and I have my own resources. The question is, are you ready to dive back into that world, to become someone else again?" Sarah looked at her reflection in the window, thinking about the woman she'd been when she met James, the woman she'd become while taking him down, and the woman she might need to become for this new mission. "I'll need a new wardrobe," she said finally. "Something that suggests old money, not nouveau riche. They'll be looking for that." She could hear the smile in Helena's voice. "I'll have my tailor call you, and Sarah, thank you. Not just for this, but for giving my son a chance at redemption. Not everyone would have made that choice." After hanging up, Sarah sat at her desk and began planning. She'd need to craft a new identity, one that could withstand serious scrutiny. She'd need to master new skills, learn to move in even higher circles than before. And most importantly, she'd need to stay focused on the ultimate goal, not revenge, but justice. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. When she opened it, her breath caught. It was a photo of a familiar face, James, or Stefan rather, sitting at a small cafe in Montenegro. He was reading a newspaper, looking relaxed in a way she'd never seen during their marriage. Below the photo was a message. "Some people can change. Let's make sure these others don't hurt anyone else." Sarah saved the photo, then began making lists. She had 6 weeks until the gala, 6 weeks to transform herself once again, to prepare for a mission that would put everything she'd learned to the test. As she worked, a plan began to take shape in her mind. These people had spent years building their empire of deception, thinking themselves untouchable. They had no idea that their perfect world was about to be dismantled by someone who had learned from the best, someone who understood that sometimes the greatest con of all was making people face the truth about themselves. Sarah's transformation into Caroline Astor Whitney was meticulous. Helena's contacts provided her with an impeccable background: fourth-generation Newport money, private schools, a trust fund that had somehow survived the 2008 financial crisis unscathed. Every detail was carefully crafted to withstand the kind of deep scrutiny she knew these predators would perform. The night of the gala arrived with a crystalline clarity to the Manhattan air. Sarah, now Caroline, stepped out of the town car in a vintage Dior gown that had once belonged to Helena's mother. Her jewelry was minimal but exquisite, suggesting old money's distaste for ostentation. "Remember," Helena's voice came through the nearly invisible earpiece, "Thomas Lancaster will be your primary target. He's their talent spotter. If he believes your story, the others will follow his lead." Sarah had memorized Lancaster's file. Former investment banker turned master manipulator, he had an eye for potential victims that bordered on supernatural. He was also, according to Helena's intelligence, getting desperate. His last 3 marks had somehow slipped through his fingers, leaving him vulnerable. The Metropolitan Museum's great hall was a sea of wealth and pretension. Sarah moved through it with practiced ease, letting her carefully crafted reputation precede her. Helena's network had spent weeks seeding the right gossip in the right circles. Whispers of the mysterious Caroline Astor Whitney's return from years abroad, hints about her substantial portfolio of private investments. "Lancaster at your 2 o'clock, Helena murmured in her ear. "He's already watching you." Sarah didn't turn, didn't give any indication that she was aware of his attention. Instead, she made her way to the champagne fountain, allowing herself to look slightly uncomfortable with the ostentatious display. Old money never approved of such things. "Ms. Astor Whitney?" The voice behind her was smooth as aged whiskey. "Thomas Lancaster. I don't believe we've had the pleasure." Sarah turned, letting just the right amount of aristocratic disdain color her features. "Mr. Lancaster, I believe you knew my second cousin, William, before his unfortunate involvement with that tech startup." It was a calculated reference. William Astor Whitney was real enough, one of Lancaster's early victims, though the connection Sarah claimed was entirely fabricated. She watched Lancaster's eyes carefully, noting the momentary flash of uncertainty. "Ah, yes, poor William," Lancaster recovered smoothly. "The tech sector can be so volatile. I do hope he's recovered?" "As much as one can," Sarah replied cryptically, letting Lancaster draw his own conclusions about William's current financial state. Though it did teach our family a valuable lesson about venturing too far from traditional investments. Lancaster's smile widened fractionally. She had him. Nothing attracted these predators more than the suggestion of old money combined with financial naivety. "Speaking of traditional investments," he began, but Sarah cut him off with a perfectly timed distraction. "Oh, is that the Duchess of Rutland? I simply must say hello. Perhaps we could continue this conversation later, Mr. Lancaster. I find myself quite curious about your perspectives on traditional investments." She glided away before he could respond, leaving him with the impression of a wealthy woman trying to hide her financial anxiety behind social obligations. Helena had taught her well. Sometimes the best way to set a hook was to be the one who walked away. "Well played," Helena's voice came through the earpiece. "He's already asking his assistant to run a background check on Caroline Astor Whitney." Sarah smiled to herself. Everything they would find would confirm her story, thanks to Helena's meticulous preparation. Each inquiry would only make her cover more convincing. As she circulated through the gala, she began to spot the other players Helena had warned her about. Patricia Dunworth, who specialized in emotional manipulation of wealthy widowers. The Callahan brothers, experts in creating fake investment opportunities. And hovering at the edges, the muscle, men with expensive suits and cold eyes who enforce the organization's will when necessary. "Time to meet Patricia," Helena instructed. "Remember, she's sharper than Lancaster. Don't oversell it." Sarah made her way toward the older woman, but before she could engineer an introduction, a commotion near the entrance caught her attention. The crowd was parting, whispers spreading like ripples in a pond, and Sarah felt her blood freeze as she recognized the figure striding through the great hall. James, Stefan, was here, dressed in an impeccable tuxedo, moving with the same confident grace she remembered. Their eyes met across the room, and in that moment, Sarah realized that all their careful planning was about to be put to an unexpected test. "Don't panic," Helena's voice came through the earpiece, though Sarah could hear the tension in it. "Stefan's presence changes nothing. In fact, it might help sell your cover." Sarah maintained her composure, though her heart was racing. She watched as Stefan worked the room with his familiar charm, noting how the organization's key players reacted to his presence. Lancaster's face had tightened almost imperceptibly. Patricia Dunworth was studying Stefan with a predator's calculating gaze. "Ladies and gentlemen," Stefan's voice carried across the hall as he raised a champagne glass. "I hope you'll forgive my dramatic entrance. I couldn't miss the opportunity to support such a worthy cause." The way he emphasized worthy cause made Sarah's skin crawl. She knew that tone. It was the same one he'd used when plotting their own marriage. But something was different now. There was an edge to his smile that hadn't been there before. "He's not supposed to be here," Helena muttered. "Something's wrong. Sarah, we need to—" The earpiece went dead. Sarah fought down a surge of panic. She was on her own now, facing not only the organization they'd planned to infiltrate, but also the one person who could expose her true identity. She needed to think, to adapt, to— Caroline Astor Whitney, I presume. Stefan was suddenly beside her, his eyes glittering with something that might have been amusement or might have been warning. "I've heard so much about you." Around them, the gala continued, but Sarah could feel the attention of Lancaster and his associates focused on this interaction. Everything hinged on the next few moments. "And you are?" she replied coolly, letting just the right amount of old money disdain color her voice. Stefan Kovac, he said, using his real name for perhaps the first time in years. Though you might know me better as James Woodworth III. Sarah felt the room holding its breath. This was it. The moment he could destroy everything they'd worked for. But instead of exposing her, Stefan smiled and leaned in close, whispering, "I owe you a debt, my dear ex-wife. Consider this its repayment." Before she could process what that meant, he turned to the watching crowd and announced, "Ms. Astor Whitney here nearly became my latest mark 6 months ago. Unfortunately, I discovered her family's fortune was tied up in ways even I couldn't access. A worthy opponent, I must admit." The tension in the room shifted. Lancaster's predatory interest in Sarah visibly increased. If she had managed to thwart Stefan Kovac, her wealth must be even more substantial than they'd believed. "You'll have to tell me all about it," Lancaster said smoothly, materializing at Sarah's elbow. "Perhaps over dinner tomorrow night?" Sarah glanced at Stefan, who gave her an almost imperceptible nod. "I suppose I could clear my schedule," she replied to Lancaster, while her mind raced to understand this new development. As the evening progressed, Sarah watched Stefan work the room with growing comprehension. He was there as her credential, her proof of wealth and sophistication. By presenting himself as a failed predator, he was making her an even more attractive target to Lancaster's organization. But why? What game was he really playing? Her phone buzzed in her clutch, a text from an unknown number. "Meet me in the Egyptian wing in 10 minutes. Bring Lancaster." H. Sarah looked around the room, but couldn't spot Helena. Stefan had disappeared as well. She turned to Lancaster, who was still hovering nearby, and smiled. "I don't suppose you'd be interested in viewing some ancient artifacts? I find the Egyptian wing so fascinating this time of night." As she led Lancaster through the museum's darkened corridors, Sarah felt the weight of multiple gazes on them. The game was becoming more complex by the minute, with players whose motives she couldn't quite grasp. But one thing was becoming clear. This was much bigger than a simple con. They rounded a corner into the Egyptian wing, where the sarcophagi stood in eternal silence. Lancaster was saying something about investment opportunities, but Sarah was focused on the shadows moving at the edge of her vision. "I believe," a familiar voice came from behind them, "we need to have a conversation about the future of your organization, Mr. Lancaster." They turned to find Helena emerging from behind a pillar, followed by Stefan and, most surprisingly, Detective Martinez. But it was the fourth person who made Lancaster's face go pale. A distinguished-looking man Sarah recognized from news photos as the head of the FBI's white-collar crime division. "You see," Helena continued, her voice echoing in the vast space, "we've been playing a very long game indeed." Lancaster's composure cracked for the first time since Sarah had met him. "What is this?" "This," Helena said, "is the end of an era, your era specifically." She turned to Sarah with a slight smile. "Caroline here, or should I say Sarah, isn't the only one who's been gathering evidence. We've been building this case for years." "Stefan's been working with us for months," Martinez added, stepping forward with his badge visible. "After his own reformation, he decided to help us dismantle the organization that trained him." Sarah looked at Stefan with new understanding. His appearance tonight hadn't been a threat to their operation. It had been the final piece of it. His reputation as a master con man had made him the perfect double agent. "You have nothing," Lancaster said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We have everything," the FBI director responded. "Bank records, witness testimonies, recordings. Ms. Mitchell's work tonight was just the final confirmation we needed, proof that you're still actively targeting new victims." As if on cue, other agents emerged from the shadows of the Egyptian wing. Sarah watched as realization dawned on Lancaster's face. There would be no escaping this time, no wealthy connections to save him, no clever manipulations to deploy. "The others?" Sarah asked Martinez. "Being picked up as we speak. Ms. Dunworth, the Callahan brothers, all of them. It's over." Helena approached Sarah, her eyes warm with approval. "You did wonderfully, my dear. Even better than we hoped. Your experience with Stefan made you the perfect person to understand how these people think, how they operate." "And now?" Sarah asked, watching as Lancaster was led away in handcuffs. "Now," Stefan said, stepping forward, "we continue the work. There are other organizations out there, other people like I used to be, they need to be stopped. Sarah studied him, the man she'd married for his money, the man who'd married her for hers, the man who had somehow found redemption in helping bring down bigger predators than himself. "You've changed," she observed. "Thanks to you," he replied simply. "You could have destroyed me completely, but you gave me a choice instead. Not everyone gets that chance." Helena cleared her throat. "Speaking of chances, Sarah, I believe we have an offer for you." The FBI director nodded. "We're putting together a specialized unit, people who understand how these operations work from the inside. Former con artists, reformed fraudsters, and people like you, those who've learned to beat them at their own game." "We'd like you to join us," Martinez added. "Officially this time, no more amateur detective work." Sarah looked around the Egyptian wing at the ancient artifacts that had witnessed so many secrets over the centuries. Her journey had started with greed, her own desire for wealth and status. It had led her through deception, revenge, and finally to something resembling justice. "What do you say?" Helena asked. "Ready to help other people avoid the traps we all fell into?" Sarah thought about all the potential victims out there, all the people like she had been, desperate for a better life, vulnerable to the promises of people like Lancaster. She thought about how her own experience had transformed her from a victim into someone who could make a real difference. "Yes," she said finally, "I'm in." "Excellent," the FBI director smiled. "Welcome to the team, Agent Mitchell." As they walked out of the Egyptian wing, leaving the ancient guardians to their eternal vigil, Sarah felt a sense of completion. The price of deception had been high, for her, for Stefan, for countless others. But from those ashes of broken trust and shattered illusions, something valuable had emerged, a chance to protect others, to turn their hard-learned lessons into a force for good. Outside, the Manhattan night sparkled with its usual energy, but to Sarah, it looked different now. Where she had once seen only opportunities for wealth and status, she now saw a battlefield where the war between deceivers and protectors played out every day. And she knew exactly which side she was on. Stefan touched her arm lightly as they reached the museum steps. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything." Sarah nodded, understanding the depth of what he meant. Sometimes the greatest gift you could give someone was the chance to become better than they were. As she watched him disappear into the night, Sarah smiled to herself. Her story had begun with a woman marrying a rich man for his fortune, only to discover he was using her for money. But it had ended with something far more valuable than wealth. It had ended with purpose. And somewhere in the city, another con was beginning. Another predator was seeking their prey. But this time, Sarah would be ready. This time, she would be watching. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning.